Good afternoon to everybody. Good morning to those who are from the other side of the Atlantic. I'm Ousmane Diouf, working for the International Institute for Educational Planning, and I'm an expert on policy planning, budgeting, and financial management here. And today we have here a 6-7 point presentation. I'm not sure if you are on the right one, but anyway. And the first point would be about why we have to implement gender-based budgeting. And the second point is, what do we do at IIP? Since, many people think we have one common approach we have here. And the second point is the main step of gender-based budgeting, explaining what is it about, just to make a difference between the approach of budgeting and some characteristic of budgeting, which is gender-based budgeting, and explain the main step when it comes to costing and financing as one step of budgeting, and then explain the advantage and also how to scale the SCE, which is second chance education of human women, throughout policy integration. And the last point on the challenges we face here. The first point of the presentation is why do we have to do gender-based budgeting? It's not only because it's good, but because it's, the main basis of the human rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and basic fundamental of equalities when it comes to policy and the socioeconomics, implementing government policy. We need to make sure we're taking, all needs from all socioeconomic groups, especially when it comes to the relation between boys and girls, men and women. And just here to make sure when we say gender-based budgeting, we are not only referring to women. Sometimes when we see the case of Jamaica, it's disparities for, let's say, disadvantages for men. And also, when we need, or when we want policy efficiency and effectiveness of our policy, expected results of our objectives, policy objectives, we do not have to exclude some socioeconomic groups of our targets, our citizens, because it may have some negative externalities on the impact we want to have on policy when spending. And the other point is about equity. We need to look at needs where they are when it comes to costing or even having activities for budget, because when we take boys and girls and men, women, they are not the same from a natural point of view, and needs are not the same. So which means we sometimes need to take into account the needs of each of the socioeconomic groups when it comes to having our activities. And the last point is about accountability. Gender budgeting increased a lot accountability, but because at some point of the expense analysis after spending the budget, people will need to see if really we have addressed the gender equality commitment of the government. And more often, when we do not have this kind of gender budgeting characteristic of budget, it's a point where people do not see, while governments sometimes have commitment on gender equalities. And more often, it's only about advocating and not really actually spending the money to have gender equality commitment. And now, what do we do here at IIP? Of course, we do training, and our main targets are ministry and international organization staff. We have our advanced training program here, and I'm coordinating the EPM 313, which is the financial management and budgeting courses we have. And part of this course offer gender-based budgeting, not as a budgeting approach, but it's characteristic of budget, because when we see all the type of budgeting we have, we can have the line item budgeting and now performance or program-based budgeting, or even zero budgeting. All these approaches has to be gender mainstream, or let's say, address gender issues when it comes to estimate expenditures and financing we need to implement policy at the government level. And the second point or activities we do is technical assistance to member states through some initiative like GCI, which is going on right now, and sometimes based on requests coming from countries. And now this point is about the main step of gender budgeting. We need to clarify, to make sure people are not confusing the approaches we have when it comes to budgeting and characteristic of budget itself, because the approach doesn't change. It's the same when it comes to budgeting for public finance or policy in countries, but sometimes it addresses needs, to tackle difference between socioeconomic groups like men, women, or boys and girls. And the most important thing here is for any kind of budgeting you have in a country, whether it's line item budgeting, the classical approach where we just look at line expenditures without taking into account all this logical framework of the results approach or performance approaches, for example, or when it comes to program-based budgeting, which is being implemented now in most of the countries we have, especially in West Africa these days. We need, first of all, to as a first step, these three first points can be gathered in one, like, looking at the situation to describe situation of women and men, boys and girls in the sector. It could be for education, for health, for agriculture or mine or defense, and check where the policy we have addresses gender issues here. Because when we look at in many of the countries, in general, advocacy is there. They are all happy to talk about gender parities and everything. But when it comes to policy they are implementing, money they spend for public policy, there is no kind of gender costing or gender financing to make sure expenditure we are implementing or activities we are developing is addressing all these needs which are different from one socioeconomic group to another one. And the third point is to check that adequate budget is allocated to implement gender sensitive policies. Because in general, what we look at all budget constraints we have or allocation is based on some constant that comes from Ministry of Finance, and which looks more often some budget indicators for discipline, budgetary discipline, for example, and not looking at expenditure itself by socioeconomic groups. And the fourth point will be to check expenditures is being spent as planned, which is also, what we should do, whether it's gender budgeting or not, both at financially and physical deliverable when we have it in here. And the last point now is, again, the question which is addressing accountability of government is to look whether government commitments on gender equalities is translated into budgetary commitments. Because this is a very important point in most of the countries we have, not only on gender issues. Sometimes they have, activities, they have policies in the letters they will draft, but when it comes to spending the budget allocation, it doesn't take all these commitments they have. It's not reflected in the activities they have, or sometimes even if it's reflected in some activities they have, the last minute cost from Minister of Finance doesn't really take into account most of these commitments they have here. And as a second step of what we should do throughout the budgeting process, after looking at all these policies and commitment, is to make sure when you're costing activities throughout the logical framework of your programs, to make sure, we are addressing all expenditures disaggregated by sex, first of all. And second point, to assess all this gender sensitivity of the different categories of expenditure we have. This point is very important, because if you look at, in general, how people are costing, it's more often an arithmetic formula they will put and just apply it to all socioeconomic groups they have. We can take one good example is when we calculating the number of toilets we want in schools in the education sectors. In general, we put a ratio. We know the schools are mixed sometimes. And in general, we just put a ratio, number of students for number of toilets, for example. But when you disaggregate them by socioeconomic, by sex, like boys and girls, you're going to see you may need more for the same number of boys and girls, you may need more toilet for girls than boys because they may spend more time. And if you consider the time they spend, instead of just looking at the ratio, you see this expenditure is more sensitive to let's say, to gender issues. And for example, number of teachers you have to calculate when it comes just to make your projection of number of teachers you need in the system. And the second point now is about the financing, which also is very important. And as one step of budgeting, it's in general to estimate all the financing you have available by source of funding, whose funding, from public and private funding, and also external funding in general, which comes to fund all this initiative you have, like the IC policies you're having at the right now, you want women. And in general, when it comes to this macroeconomic framework, all the concerns that comes from Ministry of Finance doesn't really care about all this aspect of gender equality or even other policy. All they look at is the budget they have as percentage of deficit or deficit as percentage of GDP they have in the country. And sometimes when they have financial concerns, they just have to cut most of the expenses they have without considering priorities or even commitment they have at the sector level. And the second point is also about the investment budget. In general, they spend a lot of money, but it doesn't address gender equalities. When it comes to, for example, road construction, which, I mean, in most of the countries, they go with big investment in infrastructures. And we know, for example, when you build a road from long distance, and more often in some African countries, you're going to have trucks will go, okay, logistics and all this transport will be okay. But it's really concerning a group of, let's say, socioeconomic group of individuals or citizens of a country, which is mainly men in general. And for that kind of investment, at some point, we need to see for each of the investment, what are you bringing for each of the socioeconomic groups if you want to impact really the development you want at the country level. And the last point is now the woman priority at local level, which in general is just joining this previous point I was making, because when you go to the rural area or let's say local area, you can see roads are going there. Sometimes market on board of the road are all over the road and without no investment. And more often it's a job which is really done by women at the rural areas. Okay. And now, what are the advantages of this gender-based budgeting? We have so many positive externality, not only related to gender-based budgeting. When you look at the first point is it improves a lot budget allocation, resource allocation, which mainly in most of the countries is, let's say, expenditure or needs oriented, and not looking at all this policy aspect in some kind of logical framework where you may have to address some gender, for example, policy or any other policy. And it supports also here gender mainstream in public finance and macroeconomics we have in country, and improves the linkage between the economic and social policy outcome when it comes to budgeting. But it helps also track public expenditure against gender and development policy commitment in most of the countries, and lastly contribute to the attainment of the sustainable development goals we have. And this point is very important because most of the countries in general are struggling to see how much they're spending on most of the SDG 4 they have, especially when it comes to the education system. When you have targets it on many goals, they have to cost and see on which of these development goals they are spending the resources. And now, this is a point I think my colleagues from UN would be very happy to see. It wasn't initially, I mean, when we was titling the presentation, it wasn't there, which may bring an imbalance between the title and the content of the presentation. But in any case, here's the idea is how do we scale, let's say, second chance education throughout policy integration. through our policy integration. And what we have to do here is, first thing, to consider the logical framework we have in general budgeting. Okay, which start from making policy, designing your policy objectives, your specific objective, what you want to achieve, including the second chance education. So which means all you have to do is, first step, second chance education is bringing so many activities and has some specific objectives of these activities and has to be included in the government policy so that it's taken care throughout the budgeting process, which is the only, let's say, tools you have to implement public policy. If you want to implement second chance education side, you will have to spend it, you will have to fund it by external funding, and it will never be taken into account by public finance throughout the budget you have. But when you integrate it in the local framework of the public finance budgeting here, first step is integrated in the policy objectives. When we start building or developing policies, and from there, most of the activities you have right now, which are costed aside, will be included in the costing program sectors, as we did it right now, including all gender costing. And budget allocation also will take care of all these activities from SC education. And for budget allocation now, you will have to consider most of the source of funding you have. Some are coming from government finance, public finance, and some are coming from, let's say, private or international private sector. And another part is coming from external partners, and maybe even women who's funding SC, for example. And for that, it will depend on whether you passing by budget support or sector budget support. In any case, you will have to follow up to make sure the money is spent for these activities you have, due to more often constraints we have or budget limitation we have at country level for the main, let's say, public policy. And after that, you will have budget execution, which will be executed. If it's a budget support program, partners are there, they will have to follow and make sure government are spending as it was planned and agreed. If now it's project support where you are spending aside, all you have to do is to support and make your execution and report throughout the internal system. And last point will be now, they see outcome you have planned and how it has an actual impact. Whether you put it into the result framework of the logical framework of the government, or you will have your own performance plan where you can measure all the impact, all the outcome plan and actual impact you wanted initially in your program. In any case, if you want to scale it up throughout policy integration, you will have to integrate really your policy with the government policy to make sure it's taken care of as the first step, and see how to implement it, whether you're giving your money to the Minister of Finances or you're going to spend on the side and report on the achievement first of all. Okay, and now the challenges we have here is, the first point is, when you are in program or performance-based budgeting process right now, it's a complicated, very complicated process for most of the countries right now. And challenges we have out there is, how do we implement it? Do we have the tools to track all this program-based budgeting? Most of the countries are trying, and from, let's say, institutional point of view, it's okay. And from a systemic point of view, it's really a big problem, a big issue they have. And this is one of the challenges we have. And the second one is political support. We can say, yes, they are all there, happy to implement, talk for gender equality, to do all this advocacy. But when it comes to implement, they do not have, let's say, enough money, and they go to priorities, expenditures they cannot, let's say, remove or. And the next point is sustainable commitment. Okay. In general, when partners are there, it's alarm mode, as we said, and everybody will talk about it. And throughout the process, or even government changes, priorities changes, and more often gender equality or commitments comes at the second plan. And last point now is availability of data, because we know this is a big problem we have everywhere out there, and having data disaggregated by gender to make a deep analysis to see the impact we are having on these socioeconomic groups in the system. And the other point is also, figures related to actual expenditure are not sometimes readily available. In many countries, depending on the financial information systems they have, you may not know actually how they have spent money, because you know how you allocate it, but after spending, they don't have the systems that will report to the spending. For external funding, this is the first point. It's the first challenge you have in countries. Partners spend a lot, but we have difficulties to find out how they have spent, except allocation we have. And also for countries who are decentralized, some expenditures, for example, when it comes to the constituency, it's very hard to have the feedback of the expenditures at minister of finance level. And the other point is still related to data. It's reliability and validity of the data we have. And another point is needs of uniformity in the concept and definitions we have, because we all use the same concept, same words sometimes to do different things at level. It's the logical framework. When we say specific objectives or even outcome or output or all this gender concept, sometimes are not the same, and it needs to be addressed even between the same staff of same countries, depending on where they were trained. They have, let's say, same words for different concepts many times. And the second point is now the skills and awareness needed for the application of gender responsive budgeting. This is a big challenge, even for us specialists. We need to, we sometimes are illiterate when it comes to gender issue. Luckily at IIP, we have a good, let's say, colleagues who make sure we are all gender mainstreamed, and we build our capacity on how to use all this vocabulary and to understand most of the definition of gender in general specialists, to apply it in our area of specialists. Okay, so thank you very much. It comes to the end of my presentation, and thank you for your attention.